Okay, Shana, you have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Unmute. Okay. Now is it working?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Technology's so fun. I'm Shana Abe. I am the author of 17 novels. Most of them are romances, some of them are YA, and some of them, or one of them at least, is a sci-fi adventure story. But the second Mrs. Astor is my first historical fiction book. So it's my historical fiction debut. And I decided to tackle something really easy, like Titanic, for that. Actually,
somebody has a radio on or something. I can hardly hear.
Okay, let me try to mute everybody again.
Yeah. Okay. I don't hear anything, but I hear a little bit of feedback of me, but that's it. Is that cool with everybody? Okay.
I think the feedback is more intense here.
I don't know what to do about that. Is it still bad?
It's better now.
Okay. So the second Mrs. Astor is my historical fiction debut, and it is about real people. Obviously, the Titanic was a real thing. My publisher contacted my agent, my literary agent, and said, do you have anybody, that you rep that would be interested in writing about Titanic? And my agent immediately thought of me because she knows that I love the Gilded Age and I love writing about the Gilded Age. And so she said, bingo, let's do that. And so I started looking into Titanic, which at first was just pretty overwhelming. There's a lot of information about Titanic, obviously. But I quickly realized that Madeline Astor, there was really hardly anything known about her today. And the more I dug into her, the more I realized she was intensely famous in her lifetime, just like a Princess Diana of her time. And I was astonished because I really didn't know that much about her. And I couldn't believe how much the world has basically forgotten about her. So she was the second wife of John Jacob Astor IV, who was the richest man in America at the time. Everybody knows the Astor name, obviously. And he was nearly 30 years her senior. So he met her when she was 17 at Bar Harbor in Bar Harbor, Maine. So they met at one summer during the summer season, when all the rich people would go and gather and do rich people things. And they were kind of just instantly smitten with each other. They were just known to be like, it's one of those mutual attraction, maybe not love at first sight, but just like, boom, they connected. But Jack had just been recently divorced from his first wife, Ava, of 19 years. And that was a giant scandal because he was a Knickerbocker and you were not supposed to divorce. No matter how unhappy your marriage was, you were just supposed to stick it out. Even if you didn't even stick it out on the same continent, you were supposed to just stay together. But Jack and Ava basically waited for Jack's mother, Caroline Astor, the Mrs. Astor, the leader of the 400. They kind of waited for her to pass away. And as soon as that happened, they got divorced because they couldn't stand each other. So here's Jack. He took the brunt of the blame for the scandal of the divorce. Ava fled to England and basically stayed over there just to avoid all that. And Jack came out of his shell a little bit, but he was still being shunned quite a bit by his own people, the 400, the Knickerbockers. So instead of his usual summer residence in Newport, he decided to go to Bar Harbor, where he didn't have a house or anything, but he just wanted something different. And that's where he met this vivacious teenager, Madeline. She was pretty and she was smart and she was well-to-do. She was from a very good family, although not a Knickerbocker family. And they started slowly courting and, kind of keeping it on the down low for a while. But because it was a very small society and it's a small world back then, instantly people noticed. And then the press noticed. And once the press noticed, it just blew up, went everywhere. It was in the papers all the time because here was this rich and powerful and older man dating a 17-year-old. And dating is a word I'm using, is a contemporary word, but courting, we'll say. And they stayed together. They weathered that storm. The media attention got more and more and more, and Madeline's name and face and words were in the paper more and more and more. And she was just followed wherever she went. She was under this terrible scrutiny wherever she went. And, you know, she was 17 and she was just out of finishing school. She was having to find her way around this attention, which is why I started thinking she was like Princess Diana. She just became instantly infamous and famous because of the wealthy older man she fell in love with. So Jack and Madeline just kept going, and they decided that they were going to get married, and they waited until she was 18 to announce their engagement. And then that lasted like a month before they figured they should get married right away, because the scandal was just not abating whatsoever. They get married in this little tiny private ceremony at his house in Beechwood in Newport. And then they're thinking maybe the scandal's gonna like simmer down a little bit, but instead it doesn't. Of course, she's still beautiful and young and rich, and now she's Mrs. Astor, so it's even more scandalous. So on top of that, because of all of this, she is shunned by his people, the Knickerbockers. They're not invited places. They try to host parties. Hardly anybody wants to show up. I mean, because she represents a division of the old world and the new, really. She was something that wasn't supposed to happen to their realm, and she did. So there was no getting around it. So eventually what happened is they took an extended honeymoon to Europe and to Egypt. And the person they really went with was Margaret Brown. You may know her as the unsinkable Molly Brown, but that is not what she went by in her lifetime. I've had that impressed on me since I was a kid, because I'm in Colorado and she was a Colorado lady. And so I've been to the Molly Brown house a lot. They're like, she wasn't Molly in her lifetime. I understand that that was something that the producers or the writers of the musical in the 50s made up because they thought Molly would be easier to sing than Margaret, but I don't know if that's true or not. Anyway, Margaret Brown did not shun them. She was their friend, and she and her daughter Helen accompanied the Astors up on this beautiful, dreamlike, gorgeous trip up and down the Nile in Egypt. And it was wonderful. And Madeline was so happy, and she discovers that she's pregnant. And it's just, her world is wonderful, but they have to end up going back to the United States at some point because she's pregnant and they want the baby to be born in the US. So they book a ticket on this beautiful new state-of-the-art steamship, you know, the most luxurious modern steamship of the time, which was the Titanic, unfortunately for them. And interestingly, Margaret Brown was not supposed to be on the Titanic. She was supposed to stay in Paris with her daughter Helen for a little bit, but she got a cable from her son in Denver that her grandson was gravely ill. So she had to rush back home too. And the first ticket she could get was on Titanic because they had a lot of spare first class staterooms. They weren't quite filled yet. So she had no problem getting a ticket. So that was just a weird coincidence that they had all taken this massive trip together and then ended up on Titanic together again. So that is my story about Madeline Astor and Jack Astor and their dog Kitty. I think that's a cute name for a dog, maybe a little confusing. Kitty was on this trip too. And you know what happened to Titanic. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say that Jack did not make it off the ship, but Madeline did. And she had to go forward with her life without her husband, who had been her guide and her rock through all this crazy instability that was just crashing down on her. Suddenly she was basically alone. I mean, she had her parents and her sister. She had her stepson, Vincent, Jack's son, who despised her. Despised her in real life. They were the same age. And you can imagine how happy he was when his dad marries his stepmom, who's the same age as he is. So she had to go forth. She was 5 months pregnant when Titanic went down, and she had to just keep going for the sake of her baby, which she did. And Madeline was actually known, this is a little thing that I just throw in sometimes. Madeline was even 5 months pregnant. She was one of the women who rowed the lifeboat away from the ship and toward the ship to rescue survivors again, because she was pretty sporty and she could handle an oar better than most of the other women in the boat. So she was a true heroine. And after Titanic went down, her social status completely changed. She went from being kind of portrayed as this gold digger, social climbing chippy to this tragic girl widow. That's what they called her. You know, she was just 18 at that point. And this heroine, and the media attention just went even crazier. It's hard to believe, but she had this army of media people camped outside her house day and night, because they just couldn't wait to interview her or get a picture of her. And they couldn't wait for this baby to be born. And that was her world and that was her life. And she survived that. And it, like I said, it astonishes me that we don't really know about her today, considering how enormously famous she was during her day. So that's why I chose Madeline Astor as the heroine of my book. A lot of people ask me like, well, how accurate is it? How historically accurate is it? And I can tell you it is down to the most minute details that you would never even think of. I had to join a genealogy website under a fake name to get access to her passport to figure out the exact shade of her eyes, which by the way, were very pale blue, because there were no color photographs of her anywhere. And at some point I had to describe what color her eyes were. I mean, everything on Titanic is correct. The food they ate, the cabin they stayed in, the way the decor was. I've got Kitty the dog goes on this misadventure in Egypt, and that really happened. I discovered that in a letter that Madeline's sister wrote to a friend of theirs about how Kitty gets lost at one point in Egypt, and they're just distraught because they love that dog so much. She went with them everywhere, and they finally found her again. So all the stuff happened down to the food that they served at her coming out party. I mean, I got a subscription to the New York Times because that was her hometown paper. And I just started researching all these archived newspaper articles about her. And that was how I was able to trace the footprints of her life, really, because she didn't write anything and she didn't like to be in the papers. So she didn't really participate voluntarily in any of this media attention. So it was interesting to try to figure out who she was based on how the media portrayed her. Okay, I think I've described that book pretty well now. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Anything at all?
What happened with the baby?
The baby was born. Oh, that's a good question. So I actually, somebody else pointed out to me that they were really glad that I structured the novel the way I did, because the book opens with her writing a letter to her newborn son. The baby was fine. His name is Jakey. He survived. Everything was fine. She opens with this letter that she's writing in the first person to her darling Jakey to describe some of her memories of Jack, because she realizes her son will have absolutely no memory of his father whatsoever. So she wants to write it down for him. So most of the chapters open with a segment of this letter describing her life, their history, what happened between them. And then the chapter switches into third person. So instead of being inside Madeline's head, which you are for a little bit, you're kind of with her as her story unfolds. So you're standing beside her kind of as all these things happen to her. So the baby turned out fine. He was fine. Thank goodness.
I was wondering if you had thought about, well, first, I love the way that you structured the book. I thought that was really, it was elegant and it worked really well. And your descriptions were fabulous. I was so taken with, I've never worn fur before, but I felt when I was reading it, I could almost feel the softness of the fur and the coolness of the jewels against and so I thought you did a fabulous job doing that.
Oh, thank you. Yes, she was luxe. She wore a lot of jewelry because that's what Jack liked. And yes, I don't wear furs either, but I have worn them in the past. And I know what that feels like. They're very heavy. They're very like comforting in some way, but they're also just draping you and everything. Yeah, she definitely would have worn furs. There is the story where she gives away her two furs to the steerage survivors. That happened too. She had extra clothing on and she saw people freezing. And one of the crewmen, one of the oarsmen in the lifeboat saw her give her fox shawl to this young Swedish mother with her baby to keep them warmer. So he told the papers about that, which is how I found out. So yeah, that really happened as well. I'm sorry, I think I interrupted somebody else. Oh, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Okay.
Well, I thought the descriptions were unbelievable. I mean, your writing, it's the first book I've read by you. And I would definitely, I'm very excited to hear this is just, you've written 17 books.
Thank you.
But what's interesting is that there was a point where I was reading that it almost made me feel, it was the first few chapters that says, oh my, it encouraged me to want to write a book almost.
Oh, really? Oh, that's great.
At one point, it was like, the descriptions are just phenomenal. I mean, you could feel things like Susan was saying, Susan Miller, you know?
Thank you.
Oh my God, awesome.
Thank you so
I'm not
much.
done with the book. I'm not done with the book, but I wanted to come anyway.
Uh-oh. I hope I didn't spoil the ending for you.
It's okay.
Whatever happened to Jakey?
Jakey,
Did he make anything of himself, or?
well, Jakey had a little bit of an interesting history. I think I mentioned that Vincent, Jakey's half-brother, never liked Madeline. And in fact, I mean, I have them reconcile a bit in the story because they did a little bit, but Vincent never got over his bitterness of Madeline being his stepmother, basically. So he would actually tell people that he didn't even believe that Jakey was his half-brother. He thought that Madeline was already pregnant or something, which she wasn't. I've heard that somewhere else too, but that would have been like a year-long pregnancy, and I'm pretty sure that's not physically possible. So no, he definitely was John Jacob Astor's second son. He in Jack's will, Madeline got, this is how the Astors all structured it. Madeline got a trust of $5 million, and she got the use of the Fifth Avenue Chateau for her lifetime, and everything in it, and his cars and his stable and everything, as long as she did not remarry. That's the way. And when I first read that, I'm like, Jack was a jerk. Oh my God. But that was actually how the Astors always kept their fortune intact. They kind of did it in the medieval feudal England kind of way, where everything goes to the eldest son and everything else is just kind of split apart. So in the anti-nuptial agreement that Jack and Madeline both signed right before they got married, she knew about this provision, and it was said in his will that any children he had with her would have $3 million outright. And I'm sure he meant to revise that. I mean, nobody thought that he was going to die 7 months into their marriage.
Yeah.
And they didn't even know that she was pregnant when they went to Egypt. So he didn't get a chance to do anything else about that, except Jakey got $3 million and Vincent got like 500 million or something like that, some enormous amount. And as Jakey grew up, Madeline remarried a couple times, and he had 2 other half-brothers. And he was kind of estranged from his brother, his half-brother, and his half-sister, Alice. And eventually he ended up trying to sue Vincent for a greater share of their father's estate. And it settled out of court, but he didn't really get very much. So Jakey was fine. He did fine. He was still quite wealthy. He just wasn't like as wealthy as his brother, Vincent Astor, who ended up becoming this enormous philanthropist and everything. So Vincent wasn't all bad, but he did not like Madeline or Jakey.
So where did the half-sister Alice come from?
Alice was the daughter of Ava, Jack's first wife.
Okay.
Yeah, so she was actually quite young, and there was a rumor that part of the book is true, that she really wasn't his daughter, actually, because they were sort of both accused of having an affair or having different affairs, and some people were like, yeah, she doesn't even look like him, and she didn't actually, but who knows? I don't know. I'm not going to say that that's true or not, but yes, Alice was Jack's only daughter. And
$3 million in that day was a lot of money also.
Yes, it was. Yes. I mean, it's nothing to sneeze at. That's what I'm saying. He was fine. He was fine financially. He just wasn't like bonkers rich. He was very rich.
Well, $3 million then is like 30 million now. So
yeah.
Compared to his brother's 500 million or 300 million, that's a bit
less. His brother would have been a billionaire.
We could learn to live on that.
Yeah.
We can, but we're not an Astor.
Cut back a little bit and learn to live on that.
I wouldn't mind having 3 or 30 million. Whatever.
Was this the Astor that created the booklet with the names of the society? Who was the top society family?
Yes. Yeah. So that would have been Lena Astor, a generation before Jack's mom. She was scary, formidable woman, and she ruled society. I mean, there was nobody above her, and she made sure of that. And she was pretty grim as a person, from what I understand. Like, you wouldn't want to cross her. Like, she could make grown women cry, and she could make them flee town just by not acknowledging their presence. She had that kind of social power.
Is she the one who said you can't be too rich or too thin?
That was no, that was the wife of King Edward. What's his name? Wallace Simpson. That was Wallace Simpson.
Oh, really? Which of the Astors that built the mansion in Newport?
Well, there's a couple of mansions in Newport, as far as I know, even today. But Jack's dad built the. I think he started it, and then Lena, his mother, took over, gutted what was like, I'm going to say cottage. That means mansion in Newportese, but gutted it and renovated it and turned it into this Italianate Baroque
Marble mansion.
You're frozen, Mississippi Bunny. You're frozen.
Yeah, it's gorgeous, but it's just like, it's so much. It's just every room. I don't know how you wouldn't just cover your eyes because you're so blinded by the mirrors and the gold and the silver and the polish and everything. It was beautiful. But yeah, that was Lena that built it, Jack that inherited it, and then Vincent that got it after him. And then Vincent also, after Madeline did end up remarrying, he inherited the Fifth Avenue chateau, and he had it demolished in 1926 because his wife didn't like it. So that was interesting because there is an online auction booklet from that time that was handed out to the people who were going to buy the antiques and the furnishings and the walls and the grates and everything about this house. So you can go, actually I listed in the author's note at the end, I list the URL. Sorry, those are my dogs. I can't lock them away because they just bark. You can go online and you can just peruse the PDF file of this auction booklet and be like, oh my God. And that's just the stuff he wanted to sell. I mean, I'm sure he kept a lot of it too, but it was a lot of fancy things.
But Madeline wasn't supposed to remarry, right?
Well, I mean,
according to the death wish.
According to the
inheritance.
The way you need to think about it is that I'm sure they both thought that they were going to be together for their lifetime. Right. And his lifetime was going to be shorter than hers because he was 30 years older.
Right.
But when it became public that, you know, these were the terms of his will, that she could not remarry or she would lose the money, there was actually a pretty big public outcry against that. Because, like I said, at that point, she was perceived of as a hero and a tragic heroine, a tragic widowed young mother. And, you know, newspaper editorials would say things like, how does it benefit society to have a young woman forbidden from creating another family on her own? So people wanted her to contest that part of the will, and she refused to do it. So eventually she did fall in love again with a childhood sweetheart of hers named William Dick. And that is the man she ended up marrying. I think 1918 is when she got remarried. So Titanic was 1912. So she held out for a while, but she fell in love again and married again.
She was able to get the will changed then because of all the money she had, because an ordinary person wouldn't be able to do that.
No, she didn't even try to change it. She just left it alone. She didn't want to bother with it.
But how come she didn't lose? How come Vincent didn't come forward and say, well, you just lost the inheritance, it's mine?
I'm sure he probably did. I mean, she knew the terms of the agreement. She signed it right before their marriage. So she knew what she was doing.
Was this guy that she married also wealthy?
Yes, he was not as wealthy as
Astor. Need the money, so she didn't need the money. It wasn't worth fighting over.
Right, exactly. I mean, he was also from a well-to-do family. Again, not Astor rich, but they were fine. They were also quite wealthy too. They weren't billionaires. They were multi-millionaires.
They didn't need to set up a lemonade stand at the end of the driveway.
Yeah. He was like I said, a childhood friend of hers. So someone she knew from her echelon, this upper echelon of society. So they were like here. If the Knickerbockers are here, Madeline and her family were here. I'm like down here. So she was fine too. Yeah.
Sarah, what was the first book you wrote?
Oh, the very first book I wrote was a medieval romance called A Rose in Winter. Actually, that wasn't the first book I wrote. That's the first book that was published. First book I wrote was just this silly nonsense romance novel that I wrote when I was 17, actually. I used to be a model in Japan, and I would go to these shoots and things, and there's a lot of downtime in modeling because you have to set up the lights and get the makeup and the hair and all that stuff. So I just brought this notebook with me and I started writing down a story because I'm like, I think I want to be a writer. Yay. And it was just terrible. It was terrible. It was a really bad book. And I tried to get it submitted somewhere and nobody would publish it, rightfully so, because it was bad. But I kept changing. I'm
How
sorry.
did you get the name Mississippi Bunny?
Oh, that's the name of my pet bunny rabbit.
Oh,
I named my
okay.
computer after my bunny, Missy.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought maybe there was a story behind that too.
Just I rescue rabbits, and that was the rabbit that I had at the moment when I got the computer, and then the computer's like, give me a name, and I'm like, I will name you after my pet. So that's what I did.
The amount of research you did is very impressive, because I spent a couple of hours online trying to dig up some information about Madeline, and it wasn't easy.
No.
And not only that, I wanted to see what she looked like, and I kept on coming up with basically the same 5 photos.
Right. Yeah.
That was it. And I thought so you must have gone to a lot of primary sources and so on.
I mean, it was a year and a half worth of research. Yeah. So, I mean, it was interesting. And the more I learned, the more I was like, that's fascinating. But yeah, like you, I just kept coming up against the same pictures. And again, to figure out her eye color took this ridiculous amount of subterfuge on my part to create a fake profile for this genealogy site and say, yes, she's my ancestor. Can I look at her passport? And that's how I found out that her eyes were pale blue. And so were her
passport? From her passport, you got that?
Yeah, because actually back then, at least, I don't know how long this went on, but if you were a married woman, you couldn't have your own passport. You were an addendum to your husband's passport.
That's
So,
right.
and that took forever to figure out, because Madeline was always, I mean, since she was pretty much always married. so it took a long time, but yes, it was fun though. I enjoyed the research aspect of it way more than I thought I would.
Listen, can you get me my grandfather's birth certificate?
I don't know. I can certainly give you guys a link to the genealogy site that I used. It depends on if anybody has ever uploaded these things. And it's, genealogy sites tend to be pretty complex. And they go on, and it all depends on the members, I guess, and what they're willing to upload about their ancestors. So
sometimes they don't even have the records because they weren't born in this country. So there are no.
Yeah, well, then you might try Ellis Island. That's usually that's another source of things. The records there, though, tend to be, from what I understand, a little spotty, because the immigrants,
very spotty.
Yeah, the people would spell the immigrants' names wrong because they wouldn't understand how they would be spelled based on the way they were pronounced or whatever.
Well, they
tried to anglicize them.
Yeah, they changed the names.
Yeah.
A lot of people ended up with the name of the town they came from, and not their own name.
Yeah.
So.
It's funny because when I was studying different backgrounds, I'm Italian, and sometimes Italians, when they're angry, they'll refer to them as a WAP.
Yeah.
The WOP stands for without papers. So
it wasn't a pejorative term at that time. It just meant that
correct. It was just meant that you were without papers.
Papers were supposed to be pinned to their jacket, and if they got lost, they pinned the tag to them that said "without papers." Yeah. And there were a lot of words like that weren't meant to be pejorative, but became so because people didn't know the derivation of them.
Yeah.
So,
have you ever thought about writing about the rest of her life, Madeline's life? Because it's really interesting from what little I could find.
Yes.
It's not very long, but it's very dramatic.
Yes. I mean, that was actually pitched to me, and I pushed back a little bit because the rest of her life was not a fairy tale. She ended up remarrying twice. I told you she married William Dick, her childhood sweetheart. They had 2 sons together, and they were doing all right. And they seemed happy. The pictures I could find of them, they're laughing and hanging out with contemporaries and friends at horse races and things like that. And they loved their 2 sons. But then Madeline hired this very attractive, charismatic Italian boxer named Enzo Fiormonte to teach her 2 youngest sons boxing. And he was a gentleman. If you see pictures of him, he was a good looking guy, I gotta say. And he wanted to be a movie star. So he came to the United States, and in order to make some money, he was teaching boxing because he was also a professional boxer. And apparently this is all from what I can deduce, I'm not going to say it's fact, but I think it is. She and Enzo had an affair, and then she divorced William. She went to Reno and divorced him. And as soon as it was legal, she married Enzo. But Enzo was already married, as it turned out. He had a wife back in Italy that he didn't mention to her. Yeah.
This is a great book.
But I mean, he was not a nice person. And apparently he was physically abusive with her. He broke her arm at one point. Yeah. And so she ends up divorcing him on grounds of extreme cruelty. So in the end, Madeline died young. She died when she was 47, allegedly of a heart condition, but supposedly of an opioid overdose. So I don't know if that's true or not. That's just the rumor. So that's why I didn't really want to get into that part of it, because I'm like, well, that's very sad for her. She made some very terrible choices, but that's why I wanted it to be about this very first part of her life when she was, by all accounts, truly deeply in love with this man who was truly in love with her. And everything was super wonderful until it wasn't. So Madeline's life, like everybody's life, it had its ups and its downs, and she made some bad choices, but she made some good choices, and she loved her children and died young.
What happened to her children? What did they end up doing?
Jakey, I mean, they ended up doing just what you thought that they would do. They went into, like, the two Dick brothers, I think, went into business like their dad, and they did all right. And Jakey had a little bit more of a hard time. I think maybe because he was born famous, he struggled with his identity a little bit, I think. And so he was an Astor, and he had all the luggage that, the bad baggage that went with that name, but not a lot of the money to go with the name. So here's an example of something he did. He fell in love, got engaged to a society young woman. And then I think maybe a week before the wedding, or just maybe even a couple of days before the wedding, he broke it off with her. And then he ended up marrying one of her bridesmaids not that long later. You're like, what? That's a jerk move.
That's why he didn't get married. He met her at the wedding.
I'm sorry, you say that again?
The wedding. He met her at the rehearsal.
Yeah, right. So I read a letter written by somebody who knew him and knew her. And she said, it was an older lady who knew him since he was a kid. And she's like, it's impossible to imagine that he was not born into trauma. Like the trauma of the Titanic, even when he was not yet born, must have affected him in some way. That was a speculation. Like it just damaged him in some way. So he did end up, I think, getting married to this other lady. And I don't know much about him after that. He lived until the 70s, actually. I'm not sure about that. I think that's true.
So
This
what were all the names of the
sounds
children?
like a soap opera.
Yeah.
The mother is fooling around with the pool boy, and he's fooling around with the bridesmaid.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't watch soap operas, but I imagine that's what they're like.
Yeah. And Vincent, speaking of soap operas, Vincent also had this crazy life. He contracted mumps, and so he was sterile. He couldn't have children, but he was just known to be this cantankerous person, like just seldom made a good impression on people. But to his credit, he was a great philanthropist. So he set up all these trust funds and scholarships and things for his money to go to people who needed it and organizations that needed it. But he could not keep a wife because nobody liked him. And so I think I don't know which one, the second or the third wife, the second said, you know what, I'm divorcing you. And he's like, you can't divorce me until you find me another wife, because I'm not going to be alone. And so she had to go and interview her friends to see who would be willing to marry him. And none of them wanted to, not even for the money, until I think Brooke Astor came along, and then she married him. And she's like, well, we got along fine. You just had to know how to make him laugh. Yeah, it was a big bunch of soap opera stuff.
How many children did she have in her whole lifetime, Madeline? She had Alice.
She had three boys.
Three.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dana, what's your favorite period of time to write about?
Oh, I was writing about the Georgian period in England for a while, and I was really enamored of that because of this fashion and society and the the corsets and the hoop skirts and the powdered hair and all that. And I thought, oh, it's very sexy. It's very beautiful. So I set this entire, my paranormal series, the Dracon series, I set it all in Georgian, England, and France. And then I decided to continue it in World War I with their descendants. And I made that a YA series called the Sweetest Dark series, because I had this idea or this vision in my head of like, what would it be like? These were shape-shifting dragon people. What would it be like to have the heroine of this novel, this young dragon teen girl, fight a dirigible, during World War I, because that was the only war that they actually used, dirigibles as warships, as air balloons kind of thing. So I had this entire battle scene planned out in my head about how she's going to defeat this Zeppelin in the sky. And so then once I decided to write that, I realized, the Gilded Age was pretty interesting. It's, this is right at the end of the Gilded Age, because World War I basically ended it, but I had to do a bunch of research for that era anyway. And I'm like, that's super interesting. And so the answer to your question, sorry, the long rambling answer to your question is those two time periods for two separate reasons. Just basically because I thought they were just very elegant periods. Overall.
Well, then you're getting right into the Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway and I'm reading a book now that's a takeoff on Gatsby and Daisy Buchanan and the whole thing.
Oh, I haven't tried the 20s yet. I mean, I actually had an idea for a book in the 20s, but I have a new book that I have to write first, and then maybe I get to the 1920s era one.
On the ones that you just described, have any of them been optioned for a movie? Because it sounds like they would be good for movies.
I agree. I wish it would happen.
Have you been approached to produce any of your books into movies?
It's happened a couple of times. And then, as my agent says, it's Hollywood. Nothing is final until the contracts are signed. And even then it's not final. So I had somebody interested in this book a few months ago, but then I don't know what happened. It just I never heard back from this woman. She was supposed to contact the movie rights person in my agency. And I don't know what happened. I just, honestly, I can't imagine somebody making another Titanic movie since the one we have is so iconic at this point. But I'm not going to say no. If somebody wants to, I'm like, bring it on. Let's do it.
I was thinking about the ones with the shape-shifting dragons and all. That sounds like a movie.
Oh, that would be great. I fingers crossed that may happen someday. I don't know, but it's kind of out of my hands.
I was in I attended a Zoom lecture with two other authors at the Stryker Center this week. And they said two or three of their books have been optioned.
That's great.
Yeah, it's great, they said, but that's been for years and it's just optioned. So they can't offer it to anyone else and it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
It's just optioned and then it sits there for years.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, that's actually a pretty common story from what I understand. And, producers come, producers go, crews come and go, and you get a certain name attached to a project, and then that person gets tied up in some other project and you lost them. And if you lose that person, then you're gonna lose like a domino effect of people. So, I mean, that is Hollywood. So
what happened to a friend of mine? Do you remember the movie? It's true. My friend wrote the book. He lives here actually in Valley. Well, he used to live in Valley Stream. But he wrote the book and Hollywood just took the book and made a movie out of it. He never got paid for it.
Yeah.
That's the movie American Hustler.
No.
And he has curlers in his hair. And he won an Academy Award for that. It was a very successful, very profitable movie. He never got paid for that. They just took his book.
They do that. Something like that sort of happened to me too. And it definitely did happen to someone I know. So, I mean, there's not a lot you can do unless you can't copyright an idea, right? Unless they actually lift your words, your hands are tied. I mean,
is that what it is?
Yeah.
Was the entire movie, I was asking him specific things. Did this actually happen? He goes, Lorraine, everything in the movie is true. Mm-hmm. It's verbatim. And then I read the book. It was the same.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something that's not uncommon. Let's just put it that way, which is why you have to have, if that happens, you hopefully will have a publisher or an agent with a really strong attorney or group of attorneys to pursue litigation. But even then,
So a lawyer.
it's dicey.
He's also a lawyer, and he worked for the FBI as well. That's what the book was about.
Yeah.
And he, I mean, I remember he had the case in court, but he said, I'm never going to get money.
Yeah. Yeah. Even when, I mean, this is a true story. Disney took the movie The Lion King, right? Apparently, they basically lifted the whole thing from a Japanese production down to the names of the creatures, the animals, the main characters, and all that. And the Japanese production company took them to court. And even with a really strong case, they barely got anything because it's very hard to prove.
It happened to me a few years ago. I was sitting in a Broadway show back in the days when I used to go to a show every weekend.
Yeah, when you could
You know,
afford it.
when there was an outdoors, you know.
Yeah.
But I'm sitting there and I'm watching this show, and I think Cynthia Nixon was the star of the show. And I said to myself, this is exactly like a book that I just finished reading a few months ago. And at intermission, I asked the person next to me, I said, did you ever read such and such a book? And she said, are you thinking it's the same as this show too? I said, yes. But the book was not listed anywhere in the program. The author, it didn't say it was based on.
Yeah.
They said it was based on a screenplay by so-and-so. No credit to the author of the other, but it was exactly the same. A woman in her, like just before 50, getting early onset Alzheimer's. She's a professor. Her husband is in a certain profession. She's got 2 kids. The exact same plot with the same jobs, the same occupations. And one's a Broadway show, and they gave no credit to it whatsoever.
I know it's criminal, but you know what? I'll tell you, many, many years ago, I worked at Burbank Studio. And what I think has happened since I worked there is that they're spending such exorbitant amounts of money on these big blockbuster actors and actresses. It's so disproportional.
Yeah.
Those people should be getting not even half what they're getting, and give something to the author. I mean, it's ridiculous.
I agree.
No, but it's like, it's so out of proportion, like with, you know, sports people.
Yeah.
You know, they get one, they'll spend $20 million for somebody to play a part in a movie, and it takes 4 months to film. And then, you know, it's ridiculous. And then there's no money to be used for the rest of the film or anyone else.
I hear you. I know.
I have a question that's a little bit away from this, and that is, you said you wrote a sci-fi novel?
Yes. Yes. It's a YA sci-fi novel. It's called Starcaster, and I wrote it under a different name so I wouldn't confuse people. And I got to warn you right now that it's part 1 of 2, and I haven't finished part 2, and people are mad at me. I just yesterday I got another email saying, when are you going to write the sequel? And I'm like, it's halfway done. I swear it's halfway done.